Alright, good afternoon, folks. I want to continue this thought that I had about the Pharisees. Are we Pharisees? What does it mean to be a Pharisee? We explained in the previous video that the word Pharisee could either mean separatist or abstainer. But the question is, so we know we're generally taught in Jewish history that in the time of the Second Temple, there were essentially two parties. There was the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Pharisees were the rabbinical Jews, and the Sadducees were the Sola Scriptura Jews. We sometimes hear about other parties, such as the Zealots and the Essenes. And, the question is, who are these groups and what's the significance of these various groups? But the two largest groups that we're always told about are the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Now, the Sadducees, in Hebrew, they're called Tzadokim, or Tzadukim sometimes. It means that they're followers of someone whose name was Tzadok. Tzadok, there were two. I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little under the weather. There's a passage in Pirkei Avos, in the Ethics of the Fathers. I'll actually read it inside. It's right near the beginning. All right. It says, Antignos is Socho, Kibul Mishimon Tzadik. Antignos is Socho. Antignos of Socho received the oral Torah tradition from Shimon Tzadik, from Simon the Just. And he says, he says you shouldn't be like servants who serve your master in order to receive a reward, but rather you should be like servants who serve their master not for the sake of receiving a reward, and the fear of heaven should be upon you. I remember in Richmond there was a very fine alter bacher. He was in his 80s, passed away, never married. He would come to shul all the time, Rosh Hashanah Shabbos, a fine ehrliche Yid, and well liked in the community, nice, quiet, good person. And he told me, he loves Pirkei Avos because it's not too complicated. It's easy to understand. But then he said, but he never understood. So one time I was giving a shir Pirkei Avos. He was the only one who showed up Shabbos afternoon for the shir. And he said, and I said, I just translated. I said we shouldn't serve God just so we should go to heaven. We should serve God just for the merit of serving God. So he's like, oh wow, I always thought that meant you should go to work and not get paid. I never understood why would the rabbis say that you should go to work and not get paid. So, however, he wasn't the only one to misunderstand the words of Antignos Ish Socho. Antignos Ish Socho had two students, Tzadok and Baisus. So you had the Tzadokim, or Tzadukim, the Sadducees, and the Baitusim were the Baithusians. And, or Bothusians, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. Baithusians, probably. And these two heretical groups sprung up. When you see that, you see that they, that they're not, the originals as they claimed, but rather they sprung from rabbinical Judaism. They would claim, they're the originals, they're Sola Scriptura. I remember reading a dictionary, and it said, that the Sadducees were the more conservative branch, and the Pharisees were the more liberal branch. And I was kind of offended by that, and and it's interesting, Rabbi Beryl Wine, he learns it differently. Rabbi Beryl Wine, he said that in fact they were the the Sadducees were the more liberal branch, and they were looking for an excuse to justify their ideology. What do we mean? So like they felt it was too difficult to keep the religion, and so they came up with an idea. Oh, we're the real Jews because we only follow the Bible and we don't have all this stuff the rabbis added. That's the and so, but in order to be intellectually honest, they had to follow the standard party line. So, for example, if the Torah says you should burn no fires in your house on the day of Shabbos, they wouldn't even allow a fire that was lit before Shabbos. And the rabbis, they said, no, as long as the fire is lit before Shabbos, you could allow it to keep going. You can't do anything to keep it going, but you could just leave it there and allow it to continue into Shabbos. So Friday night, you don't have to sit in the dark, and Shabbos morning, you don't have to eat cold food. And that's, probably basically why we have like the Shabbos candles and the cholent and these things, to show our opposition to the Sadducees and later the Karaites, another Sola Scriptura movement that developed later in history. Similar type of movement. But the fact of the matter is, now, as I look back and I think about it, I realize in actuality the dictionary was right in a certain sense, that I'm saying in the classical liberal sense, that, and by certain definitions, if I generally see the word, and I have for a long time, conservative is a positive term and liberal is a negative term. So I was offended when the dictionary told me that the bad guys, the Sadducees, were the conservative ones, and us, we were the liberal ones. What does that mean? However, when we think about what this word liberal means, I think of, Glenn Beck talks about classical liberalism, which is more in line with today's libertarians than it is with today's left, which are not really truly liberal. So what I mean by that, however, we could set that aside for now, but the fact of the matter is that the Sadducees, because they want to be consistent in their teachings, as we said in the previous video, tended to be much more cruel. These were the people who would take the Bible literally, and so therefore, because they took the Bible literally, they would, poke out somebody's eye if they poked out someone else's eye. I remember, when I first started here in the hospital, of the patients, he said, I love the Old Testament because an eye for an eye, So I said, it's interesting. The rabbis say that that's talking about monetary compensation and not actually poking out someone else's eye. And then, then the fellow, he said, oh, you Jews, everything's always about money, isn't it? So, essentially, now what are we talking about here as far as the Sadducees were the ones who were stoning people and so forth. But this is not really the subject, even though we discussed this in the previous video. The subject I really want to talk about is, it's clear that the Sadducees, that was a name taken because they were the followers of Tzadok, who was a priest, and so they were his students, his followers, his disciples. And they followed his teachings, which he developed out of a misinterpretation of what his teacher Antigonus Socho taught, that a person should serve God not for the sake of receiving a reward, but for the sake of not receiving a reward. And so he understood that to mean there's no reward and punishment, there's no heaven and hell, there's just this world Because really, the Bible doesn't really talk about heaven and hell. And so therefore, the Sadducees being, they took that teaching that there's no afterlife, which was a mistake. That's not the truth. That's not what Antignos Ish Socho meant to teach. He certainly believed in an afterlife. He was just saying that shouldn't be your motivation in life, the afterlife. Your motivation in life should be the glory of God. However, they misunderstood it to mean that there's no afterlife, and so therefore they developed this ideology, which also then came to this ideology of sola scriptura, that, well, why is it that there's no afterlife? Because the Bible doesn't talk about it, and so other things, so heaven and hell must be something the rabbis made up, and so therefore, so too, everything else that the rabbis made up, quote unquote, we have to do away with. And that would be the how this movement began. Now, the thing about that is, I don't think Christians will feel very comfortable. I said in the previous video how Christians probably, they feel they have more fellowship with the Sadducees than with the so-called Pharisees, because particularly Protestant Christians have a sola scriptura theology. But if they would realize that the Sadducees didn't believe in an afterlife, well, heaven and hell is kind of a big deal in Christianity. Much bigger probably than in Judaism, even in rabbinical Judaism, where we do believe in heaven and hell. We don't make that much of a big deal about it, although, some people claim that Jews don't believe in heaven and hell, but it's not true. The rabbinical Judaism certainly teaches that there's an afterlife, if for no other reason than the fact that we accept it as a basic dogma of Judaism is that God is just, and so therefore He punishes sin and rewards righteousness and virtue. And if God rewards virtue and punishes sin, why do we see good people suffer and bad people prosper? And so the answer is that there's an afterlife. Otherwise, there's no justice. Justice has to be done at some point, and that's the afterlife. Now, the Jewish idea of hell is perhaps more like a purgatory type of idea, in how the Catholic Church understands it, that it's not a permanent thing, it's a way to purge you of sin so you can get to heaven, which is not exactly how Catholics view purgatory, but it's along those lines. It's not an eternal hell, that's not something that, although you could probably try to find something in Isaiah that does seem to indicate some kind of an eternal hell, but that's neither here nor there. That being said, so that's basically where the Sadducee movement came about, and then, like we said, they wanted to be intellectually honest, and so therefore they said that they're sola scriptura. That's basically where, although, like I said, Beryl Wines, he says that essentially they were looking for excuses to be less religious, but then in certain cases they wound up being more strict in order, again, to maintain their intellectual honesty. Now, but the real question I want to address here is, who were the Pharisees, and what is this term Pharisee? Did the rabbis call themselves the Pharisees? Rabbi Ariel Bar Tzadok claims that there's no place in the Talmud where the rabbis say we are the Pharisees. However, there is at least one place that I can think of where the rabbis are called the Pharisees. The question is, are they being called that as an insult or as a nickname, as opposed to who they actually were? So that would be because there's another, that's in the Mishnah and Yadayim, you have several cases where the Sadducees and the Pharisees are arguing, and the Sadducees call the rabbinical Jews Pharisees, Prushim, and they call themselves Tzadukim. No, but as Rabbi Bar Tzadok points out, no relation to Tzadok of Tzadok and Baisa's fame. Rabbi Bar Tzadok points out that the rabbis never called themselves Pharisees. They only quoted that the Sadducees called them Pharisees, called them Perushim. And then there's another passage. I think it's in Sota, might be in Gittin, I don't remember offhand, where it talks about different types of Pharisees. And the rabbis there list all these different types of Pharisees, and they say most of them are hypocrites and phonies and not to be trusted. And so therefore, this term Pharisee was not really a term of what political party you belong to, but rather a term of a descriptive term that kind of addressed a certain character type, a certain psychological character, what we call in psychology today we talk about different personality types. So essentially the term Prushi, the term Parush, the term Pharisee was not really identifying your, for lack of a better term, religio-political party, but rather it was a term to recognize your, it was talking about a certain personality type. And it was not necessarily talking about your ideology, but rather your psychology to a certain extent. That, people who go around, with outward expressions of religious devotion, which might not be innerly accepted, is what most of the categories. I know there was the one category that was true, that was pious, but the rest were fake, like we said, the rest were phonies, like, there's the so, there was the French play Tartuffe about this, this character who was this religious, phony, but he presented himself as being very pious, but he was very phony. And so the Sadducees would call the rabbinical Jews Prushim in order to insult them, to say that they're really hypocrites. But the actual Prushim would seem to be, it was a different group. Hard to say whether or not, they were an actual party, or if they were just...
Did you hear that?
Yeah. What was it, a gun, or was it fireworks, or a truck?
Know. It sounded like a gun.
Yeah.
But like a firework.
I don't know. So have a crossing guard now after the accident. They didn't used to have the crossing guard before the accident, right?
Huh?
They never used to have a crossing guard here before, did they?
I think they.
It's a new thing because of the accident?
No.
The accident wasn't here, it was
That-
in Acres.
That happened is after.
Oh, meaning
No, this happened before the accident.
they started having. They started having.
to do this by the beginning of the year.
Oh, okay. They had last year also?
No.
Uh-huh. So anyway, we're discussing the Prushim. If the now we can turn to what the Christian scripture talks about the Pharisees, and the question is, what was Jesus's opinion of the Pharisees as stated in his own words? I'm not, I doubt that they're real or authentic, but whatever is recorded and claimed to be his word. First of all, people should know in Matthew, I don't remember, it's 27 or 28, Jesus says, "Heed the scribes and Pharisees, for they sit in the seat of Moses." So, but then he goes on to say that they're that they are, what's the word, hypocrites. So what he basically says is, do as they say and not as they do, basically. But also, my feeling reading that is that, the Pharisees, they loved Musar, they were like, the Musar people, and they wanted to be good. They really, they really weren't hypocrites. And being called hypocrites, in a sense, was like, oh, that's what they're waiting for, the Kotzker, Lahavdil, the Kotzker, the Hasidim would wait to have him insult them, and, even to today, I know one Rav in my county that, he sometimes is a little brash and insulting and harsh, and his Hasidim, they love to hear it. They look forward to being insulted and told that they're hypocrites, and because it's an opportunity to hear what they're doing wrong and to fix. All right, I have a phone call coming in, so it's not going to go through. All right, God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe. Maybe we'll make another video about this.